welcome everybody. Welcome to the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition Presents program entitled Moose by Jared. I'm not going to say his last name. Anyway, we are the organization that in 2013, we had that huge flood you may know about or remember. We're the group that restored our watershed at that time. We got $4.5 million in grants and some donations to make that happen. And here we are in 2023, still at it. We do fire mitigation with our forest partners, and we do vegetation building along the riparian areas, weed pulling. So you'll see us in the newspaper periodically, at least monthly. And here's what happens. We get grants to do all this. However, our grants only ask that we, for whatever dollar amount they want to give us, we have to have matching funds. So that's where you come in. You're helping us help the environment. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Next month on the 23rd, we have Dawn Wilson. You've seen her in the newspaper. She's the photographer. And she's going to do a program called A Dipper's Story. Little tiny birds that are water birds here in Estes. So thanks again. And Jared's going to tell his bio to all of you.
So why am I talking about moose? I'm Jared. I run Yellowwood Guiding. I've been here in the Estes Valley for about 20 years. Been guiding for, this will be year 17. I've had about 8,000 clients. I drive them in a small car of 4 people. So 8,000 divided by 2 is how many tours I've done. And so I'm a professional, go out and find them for people, talk about it. I've worked for the Park Service. I have a degree from Penn State in Recreation and Park Management. That was 20 years ago. And so the things that keep changing. The best thing I always say about education though, is it tells you how to learn. And so I moved here, and then what I love is that for every species, there's a book about that thick, and you read it, and most people would care about this much of those books. And so you go through, and I always feel my job as the naturalist is not to be the wildlife biologist and not to be the park ranger, but to be somewhere in between and show people cool things or show them more places they would be. Oh, I'm intentionally avoiding. So on that mindset, I've probably seen the better part of 2,000 or 3,000 moose, probably the same ones a few hundred times. But most of the time in the summertime, when my clients are looking to see moose, we leave it an ungodly hour. And one of those awesome things that have changed is we can leave a little bit later, but 4 a.m. is what it takes to get all the way to the west side and all the way back on time. At least that's what it used to be. And that's what a big part of this presentation, at least the latter half, is to talk about. Things are changing. And so on that mindset, like I said to folks earlier, this is interactive. If you're not interacting, this is not as fun for me. And so I want you guys to have fun too. And so the really fascinating idea is on that mindset of finding moose, looking for moose. I want you guys to learn to pick some of this up. There's also, like I said, there's a few traps here. There's a few fun ideas. Hopefully you'll laugh. But what is that? Right? So what would Europeans call that? Correct. It's an elk. Welcome to the problem that this whole identification thing of Europeans showing up to a new land and asking, no one said, hey, what do you call that thing? They all said, what do we call that at home? And so moose exists both in North America and in Europe. So basically any place that's either in NATO or any place that's been in the news in Russia or Korea is where there's moose. There's even moose in the Ukraine. And so what makes this really, really fascinating is naming that creature is really complicated and depends on what time period are you reading the book from. And so this is the other part that gets really fascinating. When was the first moose here in the Estes Valley? Any idea?
In the 70s. when the transplant was
No.
under.
Correct, but no. Milton Estes in 1860 shot a moose. And so were moose reintroduced or moose introduced is a really interesting question. But it also comes down to this idea that they've been slowly leaving Europe and getting to North America over the last about 150,000 years. And so they've slowly been migrating down out of Wyoming very recently. And so this leads to this really interesting idea, like which settler, which person, what was their history? We're talking about someone that was from Germany, somebody from the UK, that ancestry, that would all determine, did they see an elk? Did they see a moose? We got to see where it comes down. And so here's where it gets really fun. The word for moose and elk, right, the European, og from Scandinavia, is this word that is mutated and moved around. But if you love like fun random facts, all of the word for deer in North American English are not North American English words. They all came from somewhere else, and they're not even, like, the best we can say is Germanic. And so naming this thing is really challenging, and that's what makes the old documents really intriguing. Did they shoot an elk? Did they shoot a moose? We don't really know, because you'd have to go back and there's not DNA. We can say that moose have been moving through this landscape, and almost definitely there were a few moose in Colorado right before white people showed up, and then we shot them like everything else. So on that mindset of moose, right? If we go on this idea, the scientific name, Alsace, any idea of what Alsace means in Latin? Kind of, like, everybody's kind of giving me a rough, it basically means an elk or a moose in Latin. And so their scientific name is elk, or moose, right? And so we have 4 subspecies of moose in North America, and the ones that we have here in Rocky Mountain National Park are the smallest. And so I always have to talk about this idea that it's the smallest, but if the idea of that animal's name, moose, is not what Europeans would call it, then where does the word moose come from? Any idea what is a moose? And what is the plural of moose, since everybody's shaking their head? So, lots of jokes. What is correct? Moose. The correct word for plural is moose, deer is deer, caribou or caribou. That is a universal thing, because none of these words are English, which is really kind of funky and makes it really complicated if you're not an English speaker first. Because I have tons of folks that come from other parts of the world, and they're like, I want to see the mooses. And one of the things I'll never forget, I had this couple many years ago, and they were from Germany, and they really wanted to see a moose. And we see that moose really early on, and they say, Das Moosen. And so every time I see a moose, that's all I ever think is Das Moosen. So the word moose is Algonquin, Native American. Like, it's finally we're using words from this continent. It translates to a story. Most Native American words and phrases are storytelling languages. And so where that gets really interesting is roughly it means he who rips, or one who rips twigs. And so where that gets really funky is moose means twig eater. And it's one of these things that I love, is it's very definitive. It's, yes, that's what they do. They eat twigs most of the time. Given the opportunity in our ecosystem, they're going to eat lots of willow bushes. And so twig eaters, moose. Fun side note, goose, English word. So you have goose and moose, plural of geese, and not even close. And so that's why English is really complicated. So on to the basics, right? So population is really hard to estimate because it's keep growing and it's exploding. And every time I've asked the park for a definitive answer, they never give me anything close to an answer and refer me to an old sheet. And what I love is I remember seeing years ago when I first started guiding and asking questions, that number said 60. And then it said about 80. And then it moved up to 90, and it really hasn't changed. If you still look on the park website, The one sheet says about 90 and the other one says, we don't really know. There's a study going on, we'll talk about it in a little bit. But the other thing to keep in mind is this is the small one. The Shira subspecies is about 6 feet tall at the shoulder. They will look at you way over your head if you're staring at them in the eye. So they are massive beasts. And what you got to think about, the Alaskan subspecies, the biggest, are well over 2,000 pounds. Their antlers can be over 9 feet tall. So they are monsters, absolutely the biggest thing. And so when you go out there looking, moose are pretty darn awesome just because they are so big, right? And then think about size. Females definitely are smaller. You see some number ranges between 60 to 75% of a big bull, but the biggest bulls, 1,200 pounds is a lower size safe estimate. 1,500 pounds have been recorded. So they're really big. And so this is one of those fun ideas, is the deadliest animal in North America? Moose, right? And so
How does their weight, a bull elk and a bull moose, their weight there?
okay, great question. So it's about 70, a bull elk is about 75% small, or pardon me, 25% smaller than a moose.
Okay.
Right? So if we go off of a really, really large, rocky regional elk with 700-800 pounds, you know, we can hear those exceptional numbers that sometimes get to 1,000. But I'll show you a picture of a really big bull moose here, and it's not even a question, right? I mean, they are monstrous. A cow, a great way to think about it is a cow moose and a big bull elk is similar-ish in size at peak weight.
And their life expectancy?
Excellent question. Welcome to the science that is both very sad and the wrong, like it's a great question, but it's a human question, right? What is life expectancy? 2, if you ever ask that question in nature for larger animals, the average life expectancy is 2. Maximum life expectancy, old age, is about 16 to 18, depending on habitat. And so depending on what you eat, grind your teeth, what's always going to happen for all these large animals is you will, if you live the perfect life, that means you starve to death sometime in the spring. So
It's just like a cow.
yeah, exactly. All ruminants, you're going to go through the whole
As
thing.
long as their teeth.
Exactly. And so if you want to get into like a whole other topic, you know, maybe that's one of those requests to make for somebody else to do a talk on is rodents. They have ever-growing teeth and solutions for that to make up for that problem. But if you want to like get into that really intriguingly, zoos can take care of. My joke I always say out on a tour when we talk about this exact topic is go to the dentist. So it's going to keep you alive long-term, keep your teeth healthy, and then you can digest food. Or in the worst case, on a day like today where it's single digits in the morning, you don't have enough calories and you're dead. And so eat enough, go around. The other thing on that same idea, these maximum numbers are where, you know, we always like big numbers, but the important ones I always like to think about, I was talking about dangerous, is most of these large animals can run 35 to 43-ish miles an hour. There's a speed limit in North America for almost all animals except pronghorn antelope, and it's about 42 to 43 miles an hour. And so to put that into perspective, Usain Bolt, which is still the most famous fast person on the planet, he can run about 27 for 2 seconds during his world record run for 200-yard dash. And so, like that. And so there's no way on earth you're running away from a moose. And this is one of those things that I find fascinating. Everybody comes here, and the first question they always ask is bears. You shouldn't be afraid of bears. You should be afraid of moose. You should be afraid of elk. You should be afraid of forests. But for the most part, these things, if they want to get you, can really get you. And what absolutely fascinates me is every single service member I've had on a tour that has been stationed at North Pole, Alaska, has told me that they have been either charged or attacked by a moose. The northern moose, the Alaskan moose, are way more aggressive. Our Shira's moose, especially the ones we have here, are, I wouldn't say friendly, but are not outright going to murder you for turning your back and sneezing at the wrong time. And so it's one of those things that, you know, we'll get into a little bit more too. But what's absolutely fascinating, if you go off of numbers, we're not talking COVID numbers, but moose kill about 4 to 8 people a year. Grizzly bears kill about 2 to 4 a year. So if you want to take that fun fact home, they're twice as deadly as grizzly bears. And it's because they don't run away from danger as often as all of our other animals, an elk or a deer. They're far more likely to run. A moose might run. It might stomp you to death. It might ignore you entirely. You don't really know. What I tell about here is be safe. The park and the law here locally is 35 yards on foot. Don't disturb wild. So, here we go. So, important parts of a moose, like things that are distinctive. And so, what are we pointing at? And so, what's super unique about a moose? The nose. This is one of those things that's really, really fascinating. And so that was one of those trap questions. It's not the mouth, it's not them eating, it's how they eat. They have this really unique nose that is pretty unique across all of North America, mostly unique for the world. And what's amazing is that upper lip allows them to go underwater and eat aquatic vegetation. And do that, if you go in, there's actually about 5 vertical flanges that they have individual control of. So it's almost like a hand that they can grab and pick specific parts. And then on top of that, if you want to get a PhD in wildlife biology right now, what you need to do, at least the last I've looked, is that no one has been able to get a moose eating underwater through an X-ray system to actually see how they don't choke. We don't know this exactly. There's a PhD out there. All you gotta do is get into cahoots with a zoo that has the right medical equipment. Maybe you can find out. But yeah, well, they can eat underwater and keep their head underwater and eat and not drown. Pretty amazing. So obviously female moose, but the whole point of that arrow on the rear end is often, not always, we get a moose view of a butt in the bushes, and that's all you see. And so, especially early in the season, you can't tell the sex. And so the easiest way to tell, female moose have a white stripe below their tail. And so, real great way to know what you're looking at, girl or boy. Now, of course, antlers are obvious, but you can't say 100% of the time that females don't grow antlers. And so, caribou, females and males have antlers, but it's one of those really rare things that can happen. So you can't be 100% sure. You can be 99.9% sure that if you see antlers, it's probably a boy. But one of my good friends just sent me a picture of some weird genetics from deer having fangs. And so genetics are weird and don't count it out. But that's a great way to know. If you see a white stripe, it's a girl. So here's the other thing really unique about moose is they have dewlaps or bells. And so one of those really intriguing things, not a really great indicator of age, but they do tell us a little bit, there is a difference in the sex. And so females have usually a little dangle. They get it from about year 2. And so longer ones might mean you're older, but don't use that as a great judge of age. But on the bulls, the males, then we get parts and pieces. And so you got the bag, the longer part, and then the bell or the rope, depending on which book you read and the literature and which scientist they're quoting, they have tons of names for this structure. And so the big question that I'll put out to you guys is, what is that for? Nice sarcastic answer, but probably not, especially since it's a little small. We'll talk about things that do bite their necks later. That's very cool.
I would think it can get in the way of their eating underwater.
It can. And so on the Alaskan subspecies, they go really long. And it's common that the older the bull is, the shorter it is because it freezes off in the winter. And so really long ropes are like, that's one of the ways you can age Alaskan, but not ours. Right? We have different sizes. And so here's where it gets really amazing. And to think about not just how we work, but also to understand that a lot of animals have really crazy sex lives and do stuff that we would see as not up and up across the board. And so many of these animals pee on themselves in different ways. And so what we find is, I don't know if you guys ever seen that with a bull elk urinating on himself.
Yeah.
Moose don't do this. Moose take more of the deer strategy of peeing on the ground and then rubbing on it. And so that dewlap, that bell, is found to be really important to get some urine on it, but they don't intentionally pee on it like an elk does. And so a bigger bell can carry more scent, and girls are really excited by a bull moose's urine. And so, you know, I always think about it that way, is at least be glad we don't work that way, right? At least most of it. And so on that other idea, the things that I find absolutely amazing is temperature is maybe the most important factor between food on how to find them. And so when I go out at that ungodly hour of 4 something in the morning, there is this common pattern, 10 to 15 minutes after the sun shines on them in the morning in the summer, they all are gone. And then in the evening time, 20 to 30 minutes after the shade has filled the valley, they all come out. And so I put those numbers up there because they're hard to fathom. Moose are heat stressed in their summer coat at 57 degrees Fahrenheit. So heat stress sounds a lot more aggressive than it actually is. That's when, if you're in the sun or if you're doing anything exerting, that can be too much. There's a other magic temperature that I've observed, and it's 64. So in the summertime, if it's warmer than 64, you will almost never see an active moose out of water. That's observation. You know, you can't take that as hard science, but at 68, they're too hot. You can guarantee that if that temperature is too hot, you don't see anything. And so when I'm booking my tours and people are like, oh, I gotta see a moose, and I get a few of these people every year, I'm like, well, we can go in the morning, and they hear that 4 o'clock number, and they're like, I'm like, we're gonna go, you're gonna like it. And so in the afternoon, I have to leave so late that we're out at the last minute of daylight. And this is the thing, in 20 years of being here, the time that animals are out in the evening is declining drastically. And this is why. Temperature plays a huge role. And on the other side, moose shiver, we don't know exactly. I've seen one of the major quotes is somewhere under -30 Fahrenheit. One document I found said -40. -40 is a really nice round number because in Fahrenheit and Celsius, it's exactly the same. And so really cold. Most of the other animals in our ecosystem, so elk, mule deer, the bighorn sheep, they all shiver at -4. So it gives you a really good idea. These guys want it really cold. They can handle it really cold. And then in the summertime, they don't want it too warm. And this is a great example that there are animals that have been coming across during the ice ages. They're an ice age animal that is not adapted for our current landscape. And so what's fascinating as our population here locally is expanding, they're limited by temperatures to our east. It's too hot. They're limited to temperatures drastically to our west. So they've been following that mountain chain south quite a ways. But there's going to be a point, definitely not in our lifetimes, as we have a wide variety of ages in the room, but down the road, moose might leave Colorado if the temperatures aren't right. They're very, very sensitive that way, right? And so climate change is definitely going to impact them. They already are being impacted, and we're seeing that. And so it plays a role. What is idea? So this is where anybody, educators, teachers? So I love teachers. Thank you so much. This is where I always like to throw teachers under the bus that, like, I didn't know this. Why didn't I know this? All two-toed animals on planet Earth that are not pigs and camels have 4 stomachs, right? No one ever said that to me. I had to figure this out by reading lots of stuff. And so on that idea, 4-stomach digestion is this whole process of eating tons of food and then processing it through archaea or bacteria in their stomach. And so this is where science gets really complicated, and the numbers we like are the big numbers, and then what scientists like are uniform numbers. And so I have both those numbers up there of, in the wintertime, dry weight, meaning you've taken all the water out of it. Wintertime is about 11 pounds, 24. This is for females. Wet weight, that's what we would observe. That's what if you watch them eating, 40 to 60 pounds of food a day. And that's a number that can translate most of the season where it's not absolutely snowing. And so that's a lot of food. Now think, their mouth is bigger than your hand. How many grabs does it take to get 40, that's minimum, 40 pounds of food into a bag, right? And so on the idea, 4 stomachs, bag number 1, stomach 1 is the rumen. It's basically your garbage bag. You hold it in, you fill it up. When you're fully comfortable, you sit down, you chew for a little while, you stand back up, you fill it back up. The bigger the rumen, the more active, pardon me, the less active the animal is throughout the day and how often they're up and down. So deer, little tiny rumens, about, about the size of a pretty good sized orange or so to a grapefruit. That's going to empty pretty fast. Moose, talking like a big cantaloupe or more for a rumen. And so that's going to empty out, you have to chew and process it. The whole key of this whole system, and this is where it gets crazy to understand, ruminants don't eat grass or sticks or bushes. They feed their bacteria and archaea sticks and grass and bushes, and that processes it. And so it works on this fact of fermentation. And then where it gets really cool and total into microbiology is these animals then digest in their actual true stomach the bacteria and the protozoa and everything that was eating that in their stomach. And that's how you get extra protein and all this like nutrition. So it's like when we think, how on earth can these things survive? They're working totally different than us. If you ate what they did, you wouldn't get by anyway. And so fun random fact, if you eat enough aspen as a human, what would you get? Or aspen or willow? Well, constipation, but from a medical standpoint, there's a drug in there. No, what? Oh, yeah, very few calories. But if you took aspen or willow, anybody know? Yeah, aspirin. Anybody ever hear this idea that animals chew on plants to get aspirin? Totally not true. I hear this every trail ride that goes by in the summer. Every single person's wrangler says that. And so here's where it gets fascinating. Yes, you could take that because of the dosage. How big does an aspirin have to be for an 800-pound moose? Like anybody, what sounds like we were talking about cattle before. Anybody ever see a cow aspirin?
No.
Like they're hockey pucks in size. And so, yes, they get the ingredient, but at a dosage that's very, very low, right? But if you ate it, right, general rule of thumb is about a Hershey bar size of aspen bark, or a nice big handful of willow would give you a baby aspirin. And so one of my favorite things is go down to Boulder, spend 3 times the price on aspirin for willow bark pills, and you bought cheap bad aspirin or expensive bad aspirin. And so this is one of those myths I love always to talk about is yes, they eat plants that have acetaminophen in it, or pardon me, acetosalic acid, but it's not what they're doing. They're working a totally different way. And that's the part that's amazing to think about this food is they're eating in a totally different way than we do and processing it. So think about it. If you took that and broke it down, there's trillions of possible calories out there that are completely inaccessible to us. You would get a little bit from the chlorophyll, and like we talked about, lots of constipation. And on that other idea, there's not been a great hourly cycle of how moose operate. So we can go off of a lot of other ruminants in the wild of how often are you doing what. And so there's a nice average when you study most of these things that about 8 to 10 hours a day is eating. About 8 to 10 hours a day is chewing. And so there's this fascinating idea that they're spending somewhere between 16 and 20 hours of their whole day, every day, eating and chewing. Hence why their teeth are the thing that's going to kill you. And so you're eating and chewing and processing. So fascinating side fact, how much time does a Western cultured human chew in a 24-hour period? Any wild guesses? How much? 7. All right, we'll play Price is Right rules highest without going over. 15. Anybody else? 20? 5? Everybody's over. It's about 2 to 3 minutes. That's because we cook food. And by cooking it, it makes it a whole lot easier for us to chew. And so from a primitive culture standpoint, when we're chewing, that chewing eats up calories. There's also some saliva benefits in there. So if you want to live that more natural, no one ever talks about this when you read about the paleo diet, that you got to chew a whole lot. That's one of those factors. So your teeth are what's going to make you live. And then, I got to go back. Sleep. These things don't sleep much. The size of your cerebral cortex dictates how long you sleep. We have giant brains. And so therefore, for our body size, we sleep some of the longest of any creature on this planet. And a moose's brain is a little bit bigger than a big walnut. And so you're not sleeping much. And then what's really fascinating, most of these ruminants, they don't sleep in this long 2 to 3 hour period. They sleep in 3 to 5 minute cat naps. And because they don't have a large cerebral cortex, we can find this pattern that they can instantly wake up and they're not deep sleepers. That's why it's really hard to sneak up. And so they're not sleeping a whole lot. And then here's the other part that's fascinating. When are they sleeping? What part of the day? During the heat of the day is just as likely than it is at night. And so depending on this temperature and what we're going to start seeing, I'm already seeing this now, is I get out my giant spotting scope with a huge optic, and I can tell in the first light they're out there and they've been there for hours. And so they don't care. Dark doesn't mean anything to these animals. And so that leads to an interesting other side conversation of how do they see? What does the world look like through most ruminant vision? We can break this down into deer, right? The deer family, right? So moose are a deer, white-tailed deer, mule deer, caribou. How does a deer see the world? What does it look like if we were standing next to it? Any ideas, any thoughts? No, that's my trap. What was that? It does have color. They have cones. And so so total side topic, but leads to the same idea is, how the whole pandemic thing and the whole vaccination thing went into the thing. One bad article in 1952 called "Dogs Are Dichromically Colorblind" is why everybody in America thinks animals are colorblind. The journalist who wrote that didn't know what dichromic meant, 2 colors. And so we are trichromes. Most mammals, if you don't own a thumb, are dichromes. And see, they have a blue and a yellow-green cone in their eye. So they can see bluish, they can see yellow, green, they can't see orange, red, or purple that well, right? Exactly. And so it's also why, from a hunter's perspective, you can wear hunter orange and it doesn't stand out. Their saturation is much, much lower. So this leads to why is it different? Why do we see the way we do and they see the way they do? And it comes down to this really fascinating idea that this thing and these things, eyes, are set up for women to go pick berries. Because here's what's fascinating. In a paleo culture, women gathered more calories than men. And women have higher senses of smell and vision. All these acuity things is for picking berries and fruits that guys just aren't as good at. And so ladies, way to go, keeping us alive, right? But on that same idea, where we're so different is we're really bad at motion detection relative to these animals. So how many rods versus cones you have dictate your night vision as well as motion detection. And so we're really good at seeing a red bird fly across the sky and really bad at seeing at 1,000 yards something moving just barely out in the distance. And that's where this research is showing that a lot of these animals can see and identify individual other animals of their species at over 500 yards. So think about that, like being on the other side of the parking lot and knowing who you're talking to or seeing, right? And so on that mindset, moving through, eating this food, you got different ways to go through it, right? And so young guys chomping on some willows. Moose are going to eat on their elbows sometimes. And so that leads to a really interesting idea of how you getting all that food into you, right? My favorite thing is they are semi-aquatic. They will go into that water. They will go down. The record that I found is 36 feet, but that's an extreme They're basically submarines. Usually it's like 3 to 4 feet, but they can submerge entirely. And so one of those new places to go looking for a moose is Sheep Lakes, aquatic vegetation. And so one of those things, if you go onto social media, they'll be always like, go to Sheep Lakes every day, go to the golf course to see elk every day. No, at the right time of year. And so when it's liquid, they'll be there right away as soon as that lake thaws out. And Sprague Lake, all of our shallow lakes that have aquatic vegetation are good places to look for moose now. Why? They can cool off. That temperature plays a huge role. And aquatic vegetation has a higher selenium or probably a sodium content. And so these animals have access to sodium that they wouldn't have otherwise. The bigger you are, the more sodium you need, and then the more food you just got to eat to get a big bull guy like this. And so not bad antlers. So the other thing we got to talk about quick is we got a moose study that's been going on in the park. Has anybody seen lots of collared moose? And so there's only about 40 of them. And it started in 2017. It just officially finished. And so one of the sad things about the way at least most park research works is we don't get a lot of the data as citizens until a lot later, because they don't want poaching and all the other bad things. So we'll see collars for a long time as we move through. Go ahead.
Have you noticed since the fire at Long Draw that they're coming forward into the park?
Yes, we're going to talk about that for sure. That's the last third or so, but yes, they are definitely moving. That first year after the fire, not as much. And so we have basically all types of numbers, all types of collars. It's a GPS collar system. And so what I'm really excited to see when they finally release this data is they didn't know they were going to study moose before a fire and then after a fire. But we do know that fire plays a key role in their habitat throughout their whole lifespan and the way the population moves through a landscape. And so now we've got this split data, but one of the answers might be we need to reduce the moose population. And we'll have some interesting consequences of that. So where do you find moose? What's their habitat? You got to find food and temperature. So is that good moose habitat? Anybody recognize that spot?
Yes.
Right. Is it good habitat now? No, I mean, just in general. When's the last time it was good habitat? Well, yeah, before the elk population exploded. And so that river valley should be covered in willow bushes, and it's not. And so welcome to the story of Rocky Mountain National Park, where we're working on it. Something to be really proud about is that we're working on fixing it. And, my organization right here is exactly that same idea. We're working on it, and that's awesome. But every one of these pictures you'll see with a moose in willow bushes is an overgrazed area. And so at least on the elk, what we found, and there is some research that the moose do this too, that grazing on a small amount of the willow can actually stimulate growth. And so the numbers are somewhere between 45% of the new growth and 65% of the new growth. And the next year you should have expanded branching and more biomass per area. What we're finding, at least with the elk on the western side of the park, is about 95 to 99% of the new growth was being chewed on for the willows. And our willow bushes have been shrinking. And so one of those studies that's ongoing in Rocky is rehabilitating those willow bushes. Welcome to all the fences. But willows, major part of their diet, if you give them the opportunity. And so here's a false shot from inside the fence. This is many years ago, even from now. And so those bushes are even taller. And so did anybody see that bull moose that was living inside the fence everybody, all my clients and people next to me be like, oh, we got to help him. He could jump that fence. One of those things to think about is all of those fences were set up for elk. And it was how high does it have to be to keep elk out, not how high can it maximally be. You want to guarantee to keep members of the deer family out of your stuff. You need a 10-foot fence. Anything less than 10, they can get over. Those fences are about 6.5 feet. And so they work for elk pretty well because elk are social creatures and they'll go with their friends. But moose don't care. They go right up and over the fence. And so for weeks and weeks and weeks, the same medium-sized bull moose was just in the fence, walking back and forth, putting on a show for everybody. And everybody next to me, I could hear all these random tourists being like, oh, we got to help save that poor moose. And he knew exactly what he was doing. He was living in the grocery store, getting all the food he could possibly want. And then what's fascinating is I saw him leave that fence and chase a girl a few weeks later. And so he had to finally get to the point where the willows weren't as good. And so this is the rule of thumb. If the leaves are mostly yellow, the moose generally disappear. And so green anything, green buds, green leaves. And so there's this fascinating pattern we'll talk about a little bit about how this works. But early on in the season, find some little bitty buds and moose show up. And so there's places I go with my clients that I only see moose for, I don't know, 3-4 weeks a year. And it's set. I can go to this spot at this time and bam, they're there. And then a few weeks later, they're absolutely gone. And then, you might see 1 or 2. And so this is the part that I love is in 20 years, I take notes of everything I see. Where did I see it? What's going on? What's weird? And every single year for the last 5 years, I've had a moose sighting that I have never seen before. And so there's certain places that are really reliable. There's lots of places that were perfectly reliable and now they're gone. And there's other places that they could be showing up, like literally our backyards. And so here in Estes, and every once in a while, a moose does show up. Aspens play a role, at least it seems for our moose here locally. They like aspens, that they prefer willows given the opportunity. And so one of those really, really cool things, all of the coolest science that you want to learn about is either right now or happened in the 60s. And so one of those really fascinating studies that happened in the 60s with a lot of these large animals was called a buffet study. You put out everything we know that they like, and you see what do they go to first, and what do they go to second, and what do they go to third, fifth, whatever. Willows and aspens are always preferred by moose given the opportunity. And so some habitats, aspens are going to be far more typical. Are definitely, at least in Rocky, it seems like we'll find them in willows more. But like I said, going to aquatic vegetation is one of these really important things. And so remember that temperature threshold we were talking about. What is the temperature of our lakes in the summertime? Anybody ever measure it? It's about 55 to 60. And so they like 55-ish degrees in that summertime temperature. So it's a blazing 70-degree day in Horseshoe Park. Might as well mosey all the way down the valley and hop into Sheep Lakes. And so that's one of those places that they're starting to show up. Whereas one of those fascinating things of the reason the west side of the park was so great in the past is it's significantly colder in the mornings than it is if we're here on the Estes side. It gets to almost always the same temperature in the daytime high over on the Grand Lake side versus here in Estes. But that early morning temperature, I've taken so many pictures and have showed clients pictures of little baby moose with frost all over their back. It's 32, 33 degrees. And I have Texans freaking out about it being cold in July. But that's why they were over there, and they're moving this way, partly because of the fire. And so look for them in water, but they're not always in water. There's whole moose populations that don't have anything to do with water, but we have some nice lakes with aquatic vegetation. And then not a moose, obviously, but up there, that's Cooter Lakes. Many different elevational lakes, as long as they got aquatic vegetation, are a good place to look. And so one of these fun things is moose keep showing up in more and more numbers in different places. So want to see a moose in the right time of year, break out the spotting scope, and you might find 15, 20, 30 moose in that field of view if you're lucky. Got to be the right weather, right temperature. That's Gore Range Overlook. But those areas right at the forest edges are perfect. And so welcome to the problem with our moose. Like, where are moose now? They're kind of in between. They like the aspens and the willow areas, but they also like spruce fir forests. And so going up in elevation a little bit, but not too much snow. And so you got to find that magical place. So our moose don't act like Yellowstone moose. They don't act like Teton moose. They act like Rocky Mountain National Park, somewhere in between. And so finding them in the wintertime is a lot harder, unless you go down Highway 7, go down that area. There's some habitat where we can find them, but in the national park, right, you kind of just have to be lucky. I saw 3 of them in Horseshoe Park the other day. You never know. And then the fire. Welcome to where everything changed. I had years and years of a system I wake up at this time, we go to this spot. There will be, as everybody that's been over on the west side, know the Betty Dick Road, the dirt road. That was the place. I quit my job, my real job, to guide a full time, and I took my client to that spot because they wanted to see a moose. It always worked. Doesn't anymore, because all the willows are kind of gone. Some days there's 3 or 4 moose, some days there's not a single one. But 5, 10 years ago, you went to the Betty Dick Road at 5 a.m. There were 8 to 10 moose every single day. Every single day until about July 15th. And those willow bushes shrank and shrank and shrank. And then the fire plays a role. So a little depressing. Let's go somewhere else. Antlers. What are antlers for? What's the whole point?
Seduction.
Yes, it is the male equivalent of a sports car. It is extra excess that I am growing. I have so much energy. I am so healthy. Look at these bones I grew out of my head. They have no other good use. So he who grows fastest is the biggest. And so here's where subspecies gets interesting is Alaskan moose, which are both bigger and more massive, also have what they call a butterfly pattern. They have 2 paddles. Our guys have a main paddle and the front tines. And so he's not bad, but what girls like is the palm, that flat part. So one of those crazy studies we did in the 60s and early 70s is we augmented deer antlers and found out what do girls find sexy. Turns out it's the surface area of the palm for moose. You could cut off all of the points. The girls don't care. Do that with an elk, girls really care. But the bigger the palm, the better. And so big, wide palms are more attractive. You're probably going to hit that on your 11th or 12th year, unless you're an exceptional male. And so these guys grow really fast. And so this is, again, where numbers become intriguing and important. And which subspecies are we talking about? A Shiras subspecies moose can grow about that 3/4 of a cubic inch per day. And depending on where it's growing, it might be an inch longer every day. But if it's early on, it's volume over size. So this leads to the really fun idea. Got some antlers over here if you haven't played with them, if you want to check them out later on. What are antlers made of? What are they as a system? Not calcium all the way. They are a bone. So bones are made out of what mostly? No, water's not a bad answer. I mean, close. Protein. About 50% of an antler is protein. And so all of the winter, all of the early spring, maximizing protein. It forms this protein matrix that then calcifies in phosphorus. And so if you're really into chemistry, I can show you the chemical. I don't know how to say it properly, and I'm not going to offend chemists, but it's a calcium phosphorus particle that goes in and actually hardens that matrix. And that's why if you get a really young animal or early on in the growing season, you tranquilize that animal, you could actually bend antlers. And then they slowly harden over time. And so they need calcium, they need phosphorus, especially in the latter half. And so those antlers are growing. And so on that timing, it's the other thing I always love is everyone's like, oh, is this early? Is the rut early? Or is the antler? Nothing's ever early with any of these animals. If you're a deer, it always works by the sun. Everything's by photo period. So velvet will come off at a certain time frame. The antlers will come off at a certain time frame. And it's controlled by the length of daylight. And so sometime around, oh, go ahead.
I've seen it where the velvet comes off. And the birds are there.
So that reddish is the blood vessels. It's highly vascularized tissue because you're trying to pump protein, calcium, and phosphorus up to that growing structure. And as soon as it's off, it's dead tissue. It's like a scab effectively. And so, yeah. Or if you're an elk, some of these elk and moose actually eat their own velvet. And so, are they herbivores? Everybody's a little bit in between. So at first, you grow a nice little bar. You're gonna start slowly growing. You start palmating out. And then this is where it gets really funky. If you see it from the side, that whiteness is where it's growing faster. And so there's cycles, there's some connection with the moon there that some research shows, but it's basically a stretch mark. It's where it's growing faster than the tissue can handle. And so if you really get a good look at some of these really large bull moose, you'll see banding in that. And that's when they had a really good growing season and it slows down, or that cycle of food and temperature might play a role. And so here you go, start shedding off that velvet. That's going to come off sometime in mid-September. So unlike the elk who are going to lose their velvet about 20 some days before the rut, moose lose their velvet only about 2 weeks before. They have a little bit longer time to grow those antlers to impress those girls. And so you get nice big wide spread, big old palm. And then, this is where it gets interesting. I always love to compare animals the way a female of that species would look. This guy's definitely not as impressive. Whereas this guy is the biggest bull moose I've ever seen and photographed up close and rocky. And so the only way I could describe this is if you ever met a professional football player or a professional wrestler and you're insulted by how big they are, they're just massive. We'll talk about this guy in a second because we got to talk about the rut. So you got to make babies in this system. It's this really fascinating idea of mojo. Your size plays a role, but this is where elk and moose are completely on opposite spectrums. Moose are going to take the idea of moving from place to place to place, roaming from habitat to habitat. And so you're looking for these different areas. Timing is key. Babies are going to get mostly conceived around the first week of October. So you can show up early, put on a show, but if you show up too soon, you're not going to be born on time, right? And then the thing that's fascinating to understand, cycle varies, 23 is a number you see quite often, but the amount of time a girl's actually fertile is a bit less than a day on average. You got to woo that girl a lot. And then 23 days later, another day. And so those guys go from one girl to the next girl, the next, like, hey, how you doing? It's all about smell. And so he's going to do the Flehmen response to find out, are you fertile? Are you interested? What's going on? And then she can be receptive or not. And so when she saw this guy, she came over. And like most of the time, when you see a guy show up, it's very high school. She walks away. She wants nothing to do. But this girl was one of the few girls I've ever seen of all the animals be like super excited. And then she went and started to play coy a little bit. And so they don't bugle, but they will click and make different sounds with their mouth. They'll do a tongue click or a hiccup. And so the sort of weird sound. The general rule of thumb is if you're not in your car and you can hear it, you're way too close. Right? It's not loud like an elk. It's kind of quiet. And then they'll do this interesting swaying idea. And the logic is see all of the palms to see all of his bell. And then this is where the pee is important. He, before he went out to squirt with the ladies, found a nice wallow that he made and then urinated in it and got all of his underside nice and coated. And so that big long dewlap hopefully impresses. You see the second moose in this picture?
Yeah.
Right? And so if you're not a big impressive guy, you might take a strategy of mate guarding. And so you hang up with one girl, hope she says yes sometime. So on this idea, the whole point of the rut is to make some babies. And so what's fascinating is these babies, they're really, really cute. But at first, they're just little potato chips. They're just tiny little things. That is a 12 to 13 hour baby, right? So here's a picture of it. It doesn't look anything like a baby moose. It's squished and the hind legs are all weird. They got to mature a few days. And so that's one of those great ways to tell. If it kind of hankers back and doesn't walk normal, that's very, very young, especially if they're slimy. Watch out, because mama moose is the thing that's going to kill you the most. And so out of these ideas, pregnant for about 230, 240 days. The part that's amazing to me is this little 25-ish pound baby grows to be 300 pounds by the end of the summer. And then the worst and most dangerous thing you can possibly see is a baby. Because as those babies mature, especially in our habitat that's overgrazed, they want a friend. They're not born with their twins because our habitat's not as healthy. And so the less healthy the habitat, the fewer twins we have, and they want to be your friend. And I have watched so many moose attack other moose because their baby walks up to say hi. And so be high on alert. If you go out and roam the park, a mom and a baby's kind of dangerous. And a mom is very cute and all these things. But what you want to watch for is the lone baby. Because then they say hi. I've had this happen maybe 5 or 10 times where we've run away because mama's coming, and you never want to be on that other side when baby was all alone. And so really cute. The other thing that's always fun is babies have an instinct to avoid crossing rivers. They like lakes to a minor degree, but they hate crossing rivers in their first few days of their life. And so mom will drag them. And it's of course when the rivers are raging during the snowmelt season when they're born around early June. Most babies of not just moose, but all of our large animals are born between May 25th and June 15th, right when the water comes high and right when the grass turns green. So really cute. But watch out for the murder. And then as you start to mature, you got to spread out. This is a fascinating idea. Unlike elk, who definitely give birth every year, moose can give birth every year, or maybe they don't. Our habitat being less healthy and excessively more overgrazed, and now the fire means we see way less babies, and year-to-year births, our population will probably stabilize a little bit after the fire, and then a few decades later, the population probably will skyrocket again. The other thing that's important to note with babies is your coat changes. You look like a baby, that nice red brownish color until about mid-August, and then they just look like a little adult moose. Gotta talk about predators really fast. We don't have many. Mountain lions kill a few moose. Black bears kill a few babies. We don't have the grizzly bears and we don't have the wolves. And so we're missing out on that. We gotta talk about this really quick.
Oh, someone on Zoom wants to know any predictions about moose behavior with the release of wolves on the west side of the tribe.
Everything that we see in Yellowstone. They have a minor impact at most. We should see a healthier population long term, but you know, the mindset of mass murder is just not what any of the data shows. And so wolves are minorly dangerous. Wolves are the ones that take down the adults as likely as anything else, but a sick and injured adult is really where it comes down to. Yeah. And so I do have a wolf picture from Yellowstone, but it's going to be a long time before wolves make it here. I think 10 to 15 years. So really quick on competition, I know on the time frame here. And so snowshoe hares and moose eat the same thing in the wintertime. And so that's kind of funky. Spruce buds are part of their diet. Beavers and moose have this interesting interrelationship where basically beavers make moose food and moose habitat, but moose eat beaver habitat. And so there's a negative correlation. And on that moose or on that wolf idea, beavers are beavers are wolf food. So if we're ever going to get our wolves back, we need to get beavers back, which means we have to get the moose under control. Welcome to the problem that Rocky has. And so that little thing is looking for all types of habitat, and that's, I'd say, you know, from a habitat change, we're starting to get slightly better habitat. Our elk and moose compete just a little bit in the wintertime, but I don't have any moose doing this. Anytime head is up in an ungulate means no. And so this is aggression. If you ever see moose doing that to each other or doing that to you, you run, especially if the ears are down. And so on that same idea, moose are competing. So here's the grand finale. What's the fire doing? So fire changed everything. I was terrified of these habitats slowly degrading and seeing that my moose weren't there every day. And then a fire just burned it all up. And I thought, oh, geez, I don't know where I'm going to find a moose now. So I go out 2021 after the fire. They're in the same spots. And there's just little tiny twigs of willows regrowing. But in 2022, that wasn't the case. They weren't going back in the numbers. And so they had to go somewhere. They didn't all die off. And that's where some of them definitely moved over. We could tell from the collars that some of those moose definitely moved this way. They would have spread out in pretty much every direction, looking for other habitat. But after the fire, there's a few moose still roaming around and they can find that habitat. So here's a really cool picture out of the Naturalist Guide to Rocky Mountain National Park, all of the ecosystems of Rocky. And what makes this book or this picture really, really fascinating is if you want to find moose, you want to find that chartreuse. Let me see if you can see my mouse. Chartreuse next to dark green. That's moose habitat. So the whole Kawanichi Valley, northwest side of the park, east side of the park, only a little bit, not a lot. Check out where the fire burned. A lot of prime moose habitat. And so those moose definitely had to move. And that's why we're seeing them move this way a little bit into less prime habitat. We're taking advantage of some of our fenced off areas. But that's an amazing thing to think about is now we're finding moose in places we never saw them before. I saw moose at the Alpine Visitor Center 2 years ago. They come up and over, they're down in the valley, they're spreading out absolutely everywhere. There's willow bushes, there's aspen trees, and anything. So one of the things that's fascinating is we should see on the western side of the park some regrowth. The willow bushes aren't going to be overly grazed. Because think about what does 40 pounds of food a day on our few little willow bushes trying to grow. That's why we need those fences. That's why we need this habitat protection. That's why we need some wolves to make them move around a little bit instead of overgrazing too much. And so on that mindset, that's what I love about this end is where are moose going? Absolutely everywhere. They are expanding, and that's the fascinating thing with fire. In certain habitats, they will expand and be there right away. In other habitats, it might take 20 to 30 years before they come back. Because we need to have tall, healthy willow bushes. In aspen groves that regrow really, really quickly, they're back and actually maybe in more force in some of those habitats. In willow habitat, I mean, the fences in Horseshoe Park have been up for 15 years, and it's just starting to get to that point. And so take out this idea as we start to get to the question phase. There's places you can find moose where I never saw them before. And so up by the Alpine Visitor Center, looking down to the valleys, 9 is okay. My record for a single morning is 26 moose going out looking, and sometimes 8, 10, 15 at a time. And if we go back to that beginning, there's only one girl. You can see her little white there. All the rest of those are bulls hanging out together. So sometimes they will congregate. And so I wanted to leave the floor open on that mindset of you can go out and find them just about anywhere. Watch out, but look for willow bushes, look for aspens. And then most importantly, it's a new world. And so one of these things I love the most, you want to find them in the eastern side of the park in May. They'll be on the bushes on the right side of the hill and all the way up until May 15th. If you want to find them after May 15th, they're in the willow bushes because that's when the leaves come out. And so you'll find them on the left side of the road if you're driving in on the Fall River entrance, the one that's under construction right now, really consistently. So any big questions here in the group on Zoom? Go ahead.
We up at Long Draw and we
Right.
saw one female with 4 males. They call that yard. So she decides who does it, or
So is this during the mating season or was it?
it was in September.
Okay, so they're just a little early, right? If it was middle of September, the boys always have to find out where the girls are, who's receptive. And then if they haven't turned on each other, it's one of those fascinating things that bull moose, especially if they're medium-sized guys, will kind of go around almost like turkeys and all the males will be together. And so were they monsters? Were they good? Like how big were they? Yeah. So this sounds like real typical early rut behavior of the girl doesn't really need to run away. She's not harassed, but just checking out, that's really, really common for males to stick together and move around as small, medium, big. And then all of a sudden they turn on each other on when that female is actually fertile. When she's receptive, then it's a different ballgame. And so that big guy putting on the show, hopefully he's pushed everybody else off enough that they won't challenge. And that's what the whole point of antlers secondarily is the fight. Mostly it's to show off. And that's what the whole summer is about, is harassing everybody so you don't ever have to do that.
Where in the state of Colorado is the heaviest, most dense population?
Welcome to a question that I haven't seen any good data on because it's exploding, right? The park data from 2008 to now is such a huge different number. They got reintroduced down in Creed. They got reintroduced in the Rio Grande Valley. So everywhere that is moderately good habitat that hasn't caught on fire is growing populations.
Because my perception is it's evolved.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the original area, but also with the fire in that nearby vicinity, tough to say how that'll grow, but everywhere.
One Zoom question and one question for me. So when is the moose rut?
Ooh, so moose rut, like the slideshow, is sometime between the end of September through most of October. That's the peak. And then it'll die off all the way until almost December. And so just like with our elk, we'll see them through November, December. Elk moose rut is just a little bit slower behind that. And so peak of it is first week of October. And so sadly, that's when they usually get harder, or used to get harder to find on the west side. And so they're starting to show up more on this side. We might get to see that more and more and more of actually moose. Seeing a moose fight is really rare. And I've only seen one where it was really active, but I see lots of that competition. That's what this is smart. And so that's moving.
And then my question is, I know that it's really traumatic when a cow decides that her calf is done. But
Right.
how long, maybe explain that, and then how long is that?
Well, welcome to this process that baby's born. If you're a singleton, that's what the literature called it, you're single born. If you're a singleton, your only world is your mom. She's your food, your protection, your fun, your everything. And so she's your whole world. And then the big question is, when do you leave? And so if she did not get pregnant, she's going to kick you out about a month before the moose rut the next whole year. And so you get about 14 months with mom. If mom does get pregnant, you get kicked out about 2 to 3 weeks before mom gives birth. And so the way you do this is you turn on that juvenile, you bite them, you kick them, you charge at them, and then it usually takes the baby about 3 to 5 days to realize they're no longer welcome. This is where it gets really important about habitat health. The healthier our habitat, the more twins we have. When mom kicks out the twins or the triplets, and what's amazing, they can even have quadruplets successfully. It's rare, but if you're born with a sibling, you just have a partner, and so off you go. But there's some stocks and things that you see in the literature of a juvenile moose that's kicked out by mom and is desperate. I have had them follow us on the trail a little bit. There's this one story from Maine where this moose just showed up with a bunch of black cows. Anything that looks like a four-legged partner or anything that might just cause a little bit of connection. And so I always find it fascinating that they are animals that are antisocial as full-on adults, females predominantly. And then the babies are incredibly social and they want to mate and say hi to everybody. So watch out, that's why they're dangerous.
How big are the juveniles, at that 9 month, if they get kicked out?
Yeah, they're going to be somewhere between 300 and 500 pounds. Depends on when you get kicked out.
Not small.
Yeah, we're not running into a little baby. And so they're very capable to go out on their own. The biggest challenge is, can they find food? Do we have bad weather? If you don't have that bad weather, like when's the last time we've had a really bad snowstorm and then another really bad snowstorm? That's what would kill these juveniles more often than not. And so it's not too bad as a small animal, but that's also what all the predators would target. Some dumb young kid that doesn't know what's going on and then gets hurt. And so that's where all the literature that has our predators that we don't have, those are the ones that they target, is juvenile animals after they've been kicked out by mom or in the first 6 weeks of life. And so not many predators are dumb enough to attack a baby when mom is right over there. And so it leads to something that's fascinating. Of a lot of our babies survive.
Can you talk about how moose lose their antlers compared to elk or deer?
Yeah, so elk is very set. So our date is, what is it? It's the 23rd of February, right? So in just 2 weeks, elk are gonna lose their antlers. March 8th through the 16th, elk lose their antlers every year. Doesn't matter, period, weather, anything. It's the photo period. For moose, they operate a lot more like the deer, where it's more of a spectrum. It's about a week to 3 weeks. And so the antlers are going to come off. Sometime it's down to the individual animal, but it's usually somewhere in mid to late January through February, depends on the size. The more mature you are, the more likely you lose them. But unlike the elk, we start growing the next day. Moose, just like our deer, stay antlerless for quite a while. So sometime around mid-March, you're gonna start growing that new set. And so unlike our elk, who also, everything is their antlers. Once you lose your antlers, your rank might change. Moose are generally gonna not be in big groups with other males. And so it's not a huge issue. They're not using that to shovel snow like caribou or anything like that. So it's all about showing up.
Did you know where all these are?
No,
Can you see all the colors? I mean, I'm like, there's so many things, why are you going?
why? Okay, that's a great question. So we talked about antlers are made out of protein, calcium, and phosphorus. Small rodents need protein, calcium, and phosphorus all of the off season. And so if you take a look at my elk antler over here, there's chew marks on it. And that's what happens is they get chewed up. And that's why and one of the many reasons in Colorado you're not supposed to pick up antlers is they're a vital resource for those plant-based minerals that we would need that you can't easily find, because in the summertime you get that out of your plants. In the wintertime, bones and antlers are a good resource. And so rodents are what happens. But I have seen coyotes pick up, you know, I mean, I've seen that happen in Rocky. But to find antlers, especially moose antlers, you gotta have a lot of time on your hands. And so just roam around. In Colorado, the law did change that we're not allowed to go out onto state land and look for antlers for elk in particular. And so that would impact moose as well, stressing them out during that wrong time of year when they're most vulnerable. But if you look hard.
Well, this was fascinating.
Thank you so
Jared.
much.
Thank you.
No, everything's online. Yellowwood Guiding. So ywguiding.com. If you search, you know, if anybody wants anything, send me an email is the best way to go. Oh yeah, we didn't get to the end. And so you guys had such great questions. I wasn't progressing as I was talking. And so these are all just question moose pictures. And so our last for next time, Dawn, great presenter.
Oh, yeah, she really is. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
This was wonderful.
I ask one more thing.
Go ahead.
From a landowner perspective, other than adding fences to keep them out of the hearing zone, are there other interventions that you think would be useful at all in keeping that forage, you know, not be overgrazed?
So fencing is the only thing. It's like there's only been two things that have ever worked, and it's tall fences and predators. And so
Someone has to eat.
yes, and so if they're not afraid, nothing will change. And so, you know, I've seen it where big loud trucks, no, helicopters, no, they always get adapted to whatever they're used to. And so that's the thing I love about our animals is you can drive right up, they don't care at all. And then are you going to be the one to chase them off? Are you going to send your dog out there to chase it off? Do you want to pay for the 10-foot fence? And so from a landowner perspective, try, I don't know. My argument always is give up, let nature be nature, and just be glad you have what you have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as we allow our video to download before we turn off computers, there are some antlers up here. I think they're in the show. We have that here at the bottom of the hour. So we ran a little bit longer in the presentation, which was great.
Yeah, I'm bad at time.
Big room, yeah. What was the website?
ywguiding.com. If you search wildlife tours or photo tours, yeah,